Some artists seem to impose an agenda on reality. They paint to make a point. Goya is the opposite. He's curious and intuitive. He tries to make sense of the changing world around him, using art as his vehicle. In creative terms, he's rebellious and free-spirited. He pushes the expressive limits of painting. He was from a small town in Aragon in northern Spain. He was trained in the capital of that region, Zaragoza, and he traveled to Italy as a young artist. In spite of this travel, a sense that the classical tradition was only half learned pervades his works. The distortion, rather than a strict following of this tradition, is one of the defining features of his art. In 1774, at age 28, he was hired to work for the court in Madrid, designing scenes for tapestries. From that point on, he would receive the highest post available to artists in Spain, and he would go on to have a very successful public career. The image on the screen shows him at age 42 or 43, at the height of his success. This is one of the many designs that Goya made for weavers to use as models for tapestries. The tapestry was intended for the dining room of the palace of the prince, the future king of Spain. It shows us an artist who seems perfectly in tune with the Rococo taste, then coming to an end but still prevalent in Europe. The taste for light colors and innocent themes, such as the harvest and the fall season, was common. The figures are beautifully painted. Look especially at the child who we see from the back, and at the face of the young woman who carries the basket on her head. This is a delightful picture. It could seem escapist in view of the grave tension then emerging in the social and political structure of Europe. Keep in mind that the French Revolution broke out in 1789. The king that was beheaded in that revolution, Louis XVI of France, was a relative of the King of Spain who employed Goya. If we look closely, we see that things in this image are not as innocent as they seem at first sight. Masters and servants seem to look differently at things. The man and woman and child who pick at the bunch of grapes are dressed in better clothes than the rest. They appear to simply enjoy a day out in the country. But the gaze that the working woman directs at us is different. It seems troubled. It makes her seem shy. One of the workmen to the right, in the background, stands and looks at the foreground group. There's a clear awareness of class difference here, and of the problems that this entails. Goya himself, as court painter, was a court servant. Like the people that we see here, his position forced him to be close but invisible at the same time. The combination of a refined sense of beauty with a critical eye is constant in Goya's work. This young 3- or 4-year-old boy was the son of an aristocratic family from Madrid. Goya became the fashionable portrait painter in the city. He signs the portrait in a piece of paper held by the magpie in its beak. The portrait is very beautiful. It shows Goya's deep knowledge of the possibilities offered by the medium of oil paint. We should remember that as court painter to the Spanish king, Goya was responsible for the care of the royal collection, which included huge holdings of paintings by Titian and Rubens and Velázquez and many others. He knew these paintings by heart. The red dress and the silver-colored sash worn by the boy are beautifully matched and delicately painted. The nuances of the green background are very subtle. The child is cute, doll-like. There have been many discussions about the accompanying group of cats and birds. For some, they're symbols of evil, which is a menace for the innocence of childhood. For others, they just represent household pets. Both interpretations could make sense if we look at how animals such as these were usually used in paintings at the time. Whether or not they're intended to convey a specific symbolic meaning, and I'm inclined to think not, what is clear is that in a way that is typical of this artist, the animals add an element of tension to the picture. The eyes of the cats fix on the magpie as on a prey. The cautious and menacing attitudes of these cats express an attitude towards life, a way of being in a difficult world. Goya made many drawings and prints which he published individually or as bound series throughout his life. This is a drawing made in preparation for a print of a series known as Los Caprichos. As is often the case with Goya, it criticizes social customs. The object of the critique is unequal arranged marriage. A young woman is tightly surrounded by four figures. She seems accosted by them. We see a deformed, ugly old man, the suitor, and probably the father, the mother, and a priest who are all part of this ugly business. The mother's cries seem hypocritical in this context. She is, in effect, selling her daughter to a wealthy old man, presumably in exchange for money. Goya remained committed to this and to other themes supported by reformists all over Europe at the time. Here we see, some 25 years later, a drawing with an inscription that reads, "Bad Husband." It is drawn with black chalk on a rough paper. Here you see how Goya distorts anatomy for the sake of expression. He's an amazing draftsman. His standards are very different from those of most earlier and contemporary artists, most closely linked to the classical tradition. Instead of correct anatomical rendition and the use of ancient statues as aesthetic guides, he's subjective. He seeks to create a personal version of humanity. In this sense, his precursors are artists such as Peter Bruegel the Elder and Rembrandt. Goya was not a political person in a specific partisan sense, but he was deeply sensitive to the human condition, and thus to all that affected it. Before and during the French Revolution, like reformists all over Europe, he probably looked to France as a political ideal. But in 1808, when the armies associated with the revolution, those of Napoleon, invaded Spain, a dramatic contradiction arose in Goya. Those representing his ideals had become invaders. To make things more complicated, Goya was royal painter. This meant that he would paint for the new king installed by Napoleon, his brother Joseph Bonaparte. And when Napoleon was finally defeated in 1814, he would go back to paint for the reinstated Spanish king. But then an ultra-conservative reaction followed, and the aged Goya felt increasingly uncomfortable in that environment. In 1824, he left Madrid for France. He settled in Bordeaux, and he died there in 1828. This painting on the screen is among the works he painted that are directly connected to the war. It shows events that took place on May 3, 1808. After the French troops entered Madrid and were met by popular resistance, the insurgents were defeated. This scene was inspired by the executions of these insurgents by the French army. We don't know if Goya witnessed these events. In any case, he did not paint this until 6 years later, in 1814, when the French troops had been expelled from Madrid. When the war started, Goya was 62 years old. His main business during the 6 years of war was probably surviving. He made some prints where he seems like a baffled witness of the barbaric behavior unleashed by war. In this painting, blame is placed squarely on the French army. But the tone is not of propaganda. The focus is on the anonymity of the modern executing army, and especially on terror and death. Notice the eyes and hands. They carry much of the expressive weight of this scene. And also notice the non-classical and subjective depiction of human bodies. The man with the white shirt and one of the dead bodies are painted with extended arms. They would have reminded contemporary viewers of the crucified Christ. The man in white even has wounds in the palms of his hands. Goya is not making a specific reference to Christ. He's appealing to the idea of sacrifice, so strongly linked in the European tradition to the crucifixion. In Goya's biography, the trauma of war was added to the fact that he had become deaf for life years earlier, in 1793. There's a sense in Goya's very abundant paintings and drawings and prints of a growing introspection and fantasy. This is one of a group of etchings that he probably made around 1815 or 1820. It shows a woman being abducted by a horse. In the background are two giant rats. One is eating a woman. Goya's imagination has taken over here. We don't have any clues to interpret the image. It is dreamlike. It could seem frightening, but the woman being taken by the horse does not appear scared. In many of Goya's works, images are ambiguous. This is a quality of his. Images, by nature, are more ambiguous than words. Yet in art, very often they're forced to convey something very specific. Goya seems to foster ambiguity. He uses images to let his and our imagination wander. Goya's curiosity and his ability to explore the world through his art are marvelously shown in this drawing, which he made late in his life. It is the image of a man who is old and frail, in need of 2 sticks to walk. It's accompanied by an inscription that reads, Aún aprendo, or I'm still learning. Aged about 80 years old, he seems rebellious, in this case against his age, as fascinated as ever with everything around him.